Coming up on the Lead Security Podcast with Preston Hocker.
A storm knocks out the power in my neighborhood, and some guy with a shifty moral compass decides to break into my house. First of all, this is going to be a really bad decision for him. Thanks for joining me on the Lead Church Security Podcast, where we dive deep into the strategies that keep our churches safe, while also putting some effort into maintaining a welcoming atmosphere. Today, we're going to be talking about the OODA loop. I know it's a funny word, but the OODA loop is a decision-making model that was developed by a military strategist. He was a United States Air Force colonel. The guy's name was John Boyd. The OODA part of the OODA loop stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. That's the OODA, OODA loop. The OODA loop can be used and is used in all types of situations, even when you don't realize it's happening. However, when we recognize the progression of the OODA loop and we cause ourselves to check the boxes of the OODA loop, we get to level up our security, both at home and, for the case of, this podcast, at our churches. Now, before we get any further in this conversation, just take a moment to like this episode wherever you're listening or watching. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel. And if you find value in this conversation at any time, take a moment to share this content with somebody else that might not be subscribed to this channel. Send this out to them so you and your friends, the people you work with in ministry, are all being equipped and being given tools, not just for ministry, but also for security and specifically church security. My name is Preston Hocker. I've been a staff pastor for 20 years. I've done everything from kids ministry and youth ministry, to also security ministry. I'm also a co-owner of a private security firm, which is why the security kind of made sense. We specialize in private investigation and executive protection. Now, here's the point. I know ministry and I know security. This channel is dedicated, it's designed to empower you, the church leader, the church volunteer, with tools and strategies to keep you and your people safe. Now back to the OODA loop. Let's take a moment and consider this situation. A storm knocks out the power in my neighborhood, and some guy with a shifty moral compass decides to break into my house. First of all, this is going to be a really bad decision for him. It's going to be a really bad decision based on my experience, both in, combat sports and my experience as a security professional. It's going to be a terrible decision. But let's just say this hypothetical guy doesn't know all that information. He doesn't see my security camera. He doesn't see the signs that I have for security systems. But let's just, for the sake of argument and a good story, let's just say he decides to break into my home. When he breaks in, the OODA loop starts, and he is immediately at a disadvantage. Why is he at a disadvantage? Not just because I've got combat sports experience, and not only because I'm a security professional and I'm extremely proficient with all of the tools that I have in my house, but because he isn't familiar with my house. And because he isn't familiar with my house, he stumbles around trying to both observe and orient himself, the first two parts of the OODA loop. Unfortunately for him, the would-be burglar, he trips over a dog bone that my sheepadoodle Teddy left in the middle of the hallway, which causes him to bump into the wall, and he takes out one of our family photos that's hanging, and the picture frame falls, and it crashes, and it wakes me and my wife up from a dead sleep. I hear the noises, and I can tell exactly where he is. Why? Because I know my house. I know what's likely that he just knocked over. I go straight into response mode. I know where he is, and I know all of my options. While he's still trying to observe, and while he's still trying to orient, I'm making decisions and I'm acting. I get a step ahead of this would-be burglar. I have the OODA loop advantage. It's often said that defenders need to be right 100% of the time, while attackers only need to be right once. Well, with that statement, we need to understand, as the church, we need to implement the OODA loop advantage. So how does the OODA loop apply to churches? And more importantly, how does the OODA loop apply to church security? Well, in today's episode, we're going to break the OODA loop down word by word. The first part of the OODA loop is observe. What are some things that we should be observing? Well, everything and everyone. We should be paying attention to people we know, staff members, volunteers, committee leaders, elders, people who have been there their entire lives. We should be paying attention to them. We should also be paying attention to people we don't know, people who are brand new, visitors, newcomers, whatever title you want to give them, people who we kind of know because they come, when poinsettias or Easter lilies are out, those 2 times a year kind of people. We need to pay attention to people who look suspicious, but we also need to pay attention to people who look like they fit in perfectly well. In short, we need to intentionally be observing everyone. That doesn't mean we need to make people feel uninvited, though. One of the best ways to observe people without making it awkward is to be exactly what we're supposed to be as the church anyway. We're supposed to be welcoming. We're supposed to be relational. Remember, according to Matthew 5:14, it is the call of every single believer to reflect the love of God to the world. And we don't get to put that calling off just because we're operating on a security team or in a security ministry. Instead of putting on the badge, like the sheriff's badge, which will ultimately result in someone feeling rejected or just somebody feeling ostracized, just be a Christian. And one of the best things we can do in the church to accomplish the task of observation is to make sure people feel seen. Don't make people feel interrogated. Make sure they just feel seen. Now, don't use this as an excuse to be judgmental, though. Actually be genuinely welcoming. Actually try to welcome people to your church, people that you don't know. Welcome them, greet people, and use questions like this. How long have you been coming to our church? Now, this comes from years of experience in ministry, but a lot of times when we see people that we don't know or we don't recognize, we ask questions like, are you new here? Asking, how long have you been coming to this church or to our church is a better version of, are you new here? Because if the person, let's say they've been coming for months, but you're just now recognizing that they're here, you're just now noticing them, you're setting yourself up for a really awkward conversation, and they may end up getting their feelings hurt rightfully. You also can ask if they have any children in your kids' church area. Getting this kind of information up front can be really valuable for later interactions or possible interactions. Like, say, you see this person wandering through the halls. If you know they don't have kids, but they're in your Christian education department, that's going to be a pretty strong yellow flag leaning into the red flag. See, I think children are easy to forget about when it comes to people we should be observing in our churches, because oftentimes in church security, we think about threats, and kids aren't very threatening. So sometimes we forget to observe kids. But when we observe kids from the perspective of like being a protector, or from the perspective of church security, we get to develop baselines or normal behaviors for kids, especially individual kids. And when we develop those baselines, we get to recognize and respond if they have any sudden changes in behavior that could cause us to be concerned. Beyond people, we ought to be observing anything that could pose a safety risk to the people who are coming on our property. Now, not too long ago, one of the veteran team members of my church security team was on a rove. He was walking around the church. And, when we rove, we don't just look like at our eye line. We want to look down. Oftentimes when I'm on a rove, I find wallets or credit cards, debit cards, and people are so thankful when one of the security team members finds a wallet or a credit card. They get so thankful. They're so blessed. But in this case, our team member was looking up and he noticed some rust, massive rust areas on the bottom side of our balcony. We've got a balcony on the back side of our church. And while he was walking, he looked up and noticed that there were some massive areas of rust underneath it. If it was unattended, the balcony could easily become a massive safety risk. Our staff decided to rope off the balcony until the proper repairs could be made, which really only took a couple of weeks. Now ask yourself right now in the middle of this podcast, what are some areas we need to get our eyes on? Maybe your campus has a playground or even just some picnic tables. Take some time to get your eyes on some things that maybe don't get paid attention to otherwise. Look at the playground, see if there are any exposed screws or even that, your picnic area. See if there's anything that could pose even a simple, small risk. Now, the second part of the OODA loop is Orient. The Orient phase involves reflecting on what has been found during your observations and considering what should be done next. You're essentially going to be contextualizing your observation, which means you're going to give the observations more clarity, allowing you and your team to understand how the observations that you've made impact you or your community. It requires a significant level of situational awareness and understanding to make a conscious decision. Some decisions are unconscious or even instinctual. This step involves considering what and why decisions are made prior to choosing a course of action. A simple exercise for this Orient part of the OODA loop is to play what would happen if. What would happen if is just really simple. If in your observations you find someone's moved 6 stacks of chairs, this might be based on a true story, but they've stacked chairs in the hallway by the exit for your kids' ministry wing. Go ahead and take just a moment to play what would happen if. Ask yourself, what would happen if there was an emergency and everybody had to evacuate the building? Or what would happen if some kids were playing, they're not supposed to, but kids are playing and running around your kids' ministry wing, and a kid doesn't expect those chairs to be there, and he turns the corner really quickly and bam, hits the chairs and somebody's hurt? Or what would happen if I found out where those chairs were supposed to be and I took a few minutes to move them where they're supposed to be? See, you can use what would happen if for an endless amount of scenarios. The next time you find yourself in a crowded place, play what would happen if and see what scenarios you can come up with. I do this when I'm out with my family. It's just kind of the way my brain is wired. But I'm at the mall. I go, what would happen if if a fire is in the food court? What would I do? How would I move my family? Would I move my family, get them to safety, and then go see if I can help? Those are the kinds of things that you want to do, especially at your church as the church security volunteer, team leader, whatever your role is. The next part of the OODA loop is to decide, or the decision phase. Now, the decision phase makes suggestions toward an action or a response plan, taking into consideration all of the potential outcomes. You want to do this through meetings or at the very least discussions with other people so that you can create a roadmap for your entire community. In short, don't feel like you have to make the decision on your own. You shouldn't make the decision on your own. After all, in Proverbs 15:22, we find this verse that tells us that we find success. We find success if we have many advisors. So lean into your team. Definitely lean on your pastoral staff. No one wins in the church when we do things on our own. The same is true for security, and it goes double for people who are working in church security. So make sure you're leaning on a team to make some decisions. Now, the last part of the OODA, the A, stands for action. Action pertains to carrying out the decision and the related changes that need to be made in response to that decision. For actions, we tend to lean on the combat rule of 3 as laid out in the book, Left of Bang. The combat rule of 3 essentially lays out a threshold for decision by which we have to act. The basic principles for the combat rule of 3 is this. If you observe 3 anomalies or 3 yellow flags, you have to do something about it. The combat rule of 3 keeps naturally passive people from burying their heads in the sand, and it keeps naturally aggressive people from jumping the gun. The goal for any church security team should be to create a community that is both inviting and secure. Giving the combat rule of three permission to prompt us into decision making and ultimately into action allows us to do just that. Now, the final part of the OODA loop is the loop. So we've already done OODA. Now we focus on the loop. See, we have to be in a cycle, a constant cycle of observation, orientation, decision-making, and action. OODA loop is only successful if we constantly loop it around. If you don't constantly loop it around, if you're not in a constant state of observation, orientation, decision-making, and action, things are going to fall apart. Your security plans are going to fail. Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Lead Church Security Podcast. Remember, if you found value here, please give us a like and subscribe to this channel. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of this content that we're bringing to you. If you haven't noticed, we bring it to you every single week. So make sure you hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of it. We'll catch you in the next episode.